grab a cup. And thanks again to everyone who is watching along at home. It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote for day one. Derek Thompson is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's the author of Hit Makers, How to Succeed in an Age of Distraction. And I guess he's what we like to call a kind of superstar celebrity journalist. He just announced today he will be hosting a weekly podcast on the Ringer Spotify network called Plain English with Derek Thompson. He is here today to talk to us about the future of work. And so please join me in welcoming today's keynote, Derek Thompson.
Hello, thank you so much. I obviously took the caffeine suggestion very literally, so we'll judge no one if they do the same at 3:51 or so. It's an honor to be here. I want to talk to you today about what some people call the future of work. I'm not going to use that phrase so often. It's a very lofty phrase. It can be a little bit presumptuous at times. At the same time, I don't want to call my presentation the present of work because that sounds really boring and unilluminating, like I'm just going to tell you what you did today. So I'm going to borrow a term from the sociologist Duncan Watts, who talks about the edge of the present. What is that? Well, I think the best way to understand the edge of the present is the idea that, like, you look at your phone, you pull out Google Maps, and it says that, let's say, an Oakland restaurant that you want to go to is 45 minutes away. That 45 minutes is somewhere between a description and a prediction. It is a map of the territory as we understand it. It's also telling you something about the future, where you will be in exactly 45 minutes. So it is a depiction of the imminent future based on all available information that we have right now. That is the edge of the present. And what I'd like to do today is provide a kind of Google Maps of work, a map of the territory as I understand it that tells us where we're going, how long it's going to take, and where the path might change from a smooth green-colored road to a red-colored traffic jam. So in the next half hours, we'll be talking about or touching on a lot of things: the benefits and drawbacks of remote work, the dubious necessity of the office, the great resignation, the great reset, the benefits of experimentation in our career, and the future of what I have called in my writing workism. The idea that work for many of us has come to play a very central and almost religious role in shaping our identity and our sense of purpose. My thesis here is that we appear to be nearing a great work-life convergence in American history. That the rise of knowledge work or white-collar work blends work skills and life skills. The same things that tend to make someone a good partner or a good friend are in increasing demand in the office place. Second, computers blend work tools and life tools. How many of us have been on our computer or on our phone in the middle of a day, let's say maybe on a Zoom, and we have a bunch of tabs open in Chrome, and we're like also buying shoes and also checking out what we're going to watch on HBO Max tonight, and like also texting with our partners and friends. Computers are this, obviously Swiss Army knife for life and work tools. Finally, remote work blends work time and lifetime. It's 2 p.m. afternoon, you're sitting on your couch, you could be working, you could be filing that TPS report, but at the exact same time you could be doing any number of things to push forward your life. And so I think you put this all together and you have a great work-life convergence. And pointing from the great work-life convergence, I think you have a sort of heaven or hell scenario. And the singular skill of work in the 21st century will be how to manage, thrive, and even love our work, even as it threatens to merge, smushing together with our life. So, winding back the clock, 19 months. The month is February 2020, and I am a staff writer at The Atlantic. I walk into my editor's office with a pitch for a magazine column. I say, Don, my editor's name is Don. Don, I have this really good idea for a story. He says, okay, Derek, what do you got? I say, all right, I want to write about this trend that I think is going to take off in the next decade. And it's a trend that a lot of people have predicted would take off before, but please don't laugh when I tell you this. The trend is working from home. And Don goes, I don't know, Derek. We just ran this really smart column about how IBM and a bunch of other companies who have tried work from home found that it just didn't work. It was too hard to manage people. They slacked off. Some got lonely. Creativity plunged. They missed the office. It was a whole mess. And I said, okay, that is all true. There's been lots of instances where working from home has failed. Let me give you 2 reasons why it's about to take off in the 2020s. Reason number 1, high living costs in metro areas with the highest density of knowledge workers. It's pushing people out. It's pushing smart people out to the exurbs where it's easier to just not drive to the office. It's easier to just stay home. And if you look at the research, commutes are this psychological and environmental scourge. They increase depression and divorce and fossil fuel emissions. The average commute in the US in February 2020 was 54 minutes total. So almost an hour a day spent away from friends and family in a machine, often coughing fumes into the sky. And it would just be better if we allowed people to kind of, do their whole thing on their computers from their couches. Reason number 2, we have better tools to allow people to do their whole thing from the couches. We have mature telecom technology, Slack and Teams and Skype, and you can move collaboration and gossip online. And also, I sort of wave my hand over the Atlantic office, which you have a picture of here. I say, look at our own office. It's quiet as a dormouse. It's like a library in here because everyone is already talking to each other on their computers. We're already working remotely just in the same office. We're commuting to work remotely. And he says, okay, write me an outline for this column. I gather all this evidence for why remote work is going to take off in the 2020s. I'm so proud of this thesis. It's really going to shake the world. And then, of course, my column is rendered completely moot because the world falls apart. And the pandemic takes over the world. And tens of millions of people are sent from their offices while tens of millions of other people are furloughed and laid off. And the US economy becomes this one very big, very sudden remote work experiment. And obviously at that point, hey, wacky prediction, remote work is going to take off is the most boring hypothesis to possibly put forth in an Atlantic column. So we're now 19 months after this moment. And so we should have learned a lot about whether this experiment was successful or unsuccessful. And I have my own conclusions, but I want to start, as I tend to do, with a little bit of research. This is a screenshot. I'm sorry, it's an awful screenshot. I'm terrible at PowerPoint, you should know, and just sort of bake that into your evaluation of the next 25 minutes. This is a screenshot of a big study published in Nature called The Effects of Remote Work on Collaboration Among Information Workers. Pretty relevant sounding. So Microsoft, in the first 6 months of the pandemic, Microsoft, they send all their workers home, like just about everyone else in the knowledge economy. And some of the researchers realize that the pandemic has created a tragic but uniquely useful real-world experiment. We can finally answer the question, what do offices do? What do they do? In normal times, this is an impossible question to answer. Like, the gold standard of a study to figure out what a thing does is a randomized control trial. So for example, to test the vaccines, we gathered a bunch of representative people. We divided them into 2 groups, 1 and 2. Group 1 gets the vaccine. Group 2 gets the placebo arm goo. And we measure the difference between 1 and 2 to determine the efficacy of the vaccine. But you can't do that for an office in normal times. It's very difficult to say, we've just decided that half of you can't come into the office anymore, and we're just going to measure your productivity. It's very rare to find offices that are willing to sacrifice 6 months of possible productivity just to do a little RCT. Except the pandemic really does offer us, again, a tragic but useful natural experiment. You measure how people communicated before the pandemic, you measure how they communicate during and after the pandemic, and you say the difference is the office. Of course, the difference is also the pandemic. That's why a natural experiment is not a clinical trial, but this is the closest we're going to get. So that's what they do. They measure 61,000 employees and how they change their work behavior from February 2020 to October 2020, and they publish the results in Nature. 3 big, fascinating conclusions. Number 1, not so fascinating. The total amount of messages didn't change. Kind of boring. 2, communications within groups went way up. Team connections got deeper. Number 3, communication between groups plummeted. So think about when you're in an office. All these conversations you have that aren't directly essential to your work. There's the person you got lunch with to swap stories about raising young daughters. There's the person on the way to the bathroom you often stop to say, hey, how about the Cowboys? Maybe the person who joined the company at the same time as you and you love complaining about how terrible the company is because you have like the exact same lockstep understanding of its terribleness. All those conversations suddenly aren't happening. Remote work takes a battering ram to all of them. So in summation, the silos get deeper and the walls get higher. So I read this paper and I call up the authors. This is one of the extraordinary benefits of being a journalist. I have questions and I just call people and I can talk to them. I say, I have a theory about your theory. Tell me if I'm crazy. And they say, OK, we'll tell you if you're crazy. And I say, all right, what your paper is actually really about is hard work and soft work. And they say, I don't know what that means. And I say, neither do I. I just made up this term like half an hour ago. But I'm going to tell you what I think it means, and you can help me refine the definition. So imagine dividing the day's work into two, hard work, soft work. Hard work is what I am literally paid to do. Reading, researching, calling people, transcribing conversations, writing articles. For others, it's managing employees, working in Excel and PowerPoint, reading and writing a zillion emails. It's hard work because it's literal work, not because it's physically arduous. If the past year and a half has taught us anything, it's that white-collar employees can do hard work just about anywhere, from the office, from their phone, from their home, from a bus, from Dubai, from anywhere. They can be similarly productive when you're evaluating hard work. But soft work is different. Soft work is like the vague middle space of weekday activity. It's not work, but it's not hard work. Soft work is like getting coffee with a coworker. It is catching up with that friend about the NFL. It is networking and schmoozing and gossiping and even mildly annoying people on your floor with, hey, does this idea suck? Those are all species of behavior, and they exist under the genus of soft work. So office's biggest advantage, the job of the office, you could say, is not hard work, it's soft work. And the trillion-dollar question is, so what? Who cares? So on the one hand, you could say soft work is utterly essential to productivity. There's lots of productivity experts that have been telling us for decades that cross-group communication and collaboration is like the skeleton key to unlocking radical creativity. And in the abstract, that seems totally plausible. Like the history of scientific and technological invention is, in large part, a history of smart people making giant leaps forward by combining disparate ideas in domains adjacent to their expertise. Soft work is really important to that. Just mindless gossip can be really important to making those breakthrough leaps. But if this conventional wisdom were true, if soft work were so essential to our lives, how do you explain GDP? How do you explain Microsoft's stock? How do you explain the fact that all these companies, when they went remote, seemed to be kind of more or less, in the biggest picture, totally fine? It should make us think, maybe soft work might not be as important to the knowledge economy as we thought it was. So several years ago, Google conducted a big, very famous research project on its most productive groups. And the company found that the most important quality to creativity was something they called psychological safety. That's the idea that you have confidence that if you propose some nutty idea, team members won't embarrass you or punish you for speaking up. Now, what might be important about the office in the long term, even if you look at Microsoft stock, which is fantastic, and even if you look at current GDP, which is above where it was in February 2020, you could still, I think, make this point, that online communications can be a minefield for psychological safety. Like, I think we've all had this experience where we had an idea we felt very protective of, and we texted it or Slacked it or G-chatted it to someone in our office. We said, hey, here's my really big, nascent, vulnerable idea. And they typed back, OK. No exclamation point, no smiley face, OK. Like, you think this person hates me, they hate my ideas, they think I'm worthless, my confidence is completely shot, I'm going to go lock myself in the bathroom and cry. At the same time, if you did this in person, if I hand my project, my report, let's say, to my editor, and he says, OK, totally different. Just hearing the intonation in his voice, maybe seeing his face, seeing his body language, that's all data that I don't have when I'm talking to people remotely. So When we read a sentence on GChat or Slack that seems underenthusiastic or ambiguous or sarcastic to us, we often default to thinking, you're a jerk and I'm an idiot. But if someone had said the same thing to our face, we'd be laughing with them. We get more data from people when we can see their face, their gesticulations, their whole self. And banter and bad jokes, you can dismiss them as empty blather, but they might be a kind of carrier wave for psychological safety that makes productive work possible in the long run. I don't actually have a strong thesis here, but I think the question is really important. One, are offices truly specializing in hard work? I feel pretty sure about that. And two, soft work. And two, how important is soft work for creativity? Is it totally worthless, or is it quietly that seed you have to plant in order to have a beautiful tree of an idea grow some years later? So let's bring in a bit more data to see where remote work stands right now. This is the share of remote work in the pandemic by occupation. The y-axis goes 0 to 60. The x-axis goes July 2020 to today. Let's start from the bottom here. The green line is the services industry. Restaurants, hotels, hospitals. Obviously not much happening here in terms of remote work. It's really, really difficult to essentially be a brain surgeon from your couch. It's hard to be a waiter from your living room, et cetera. Next up, you have the blue line. This is sales and offices. But the line to focus on, I think, is the red line up top. That's managerial roles, professional services jobs. This category peaked, and I'm sorry that the y-axis is cut off. It peaked at 60% last summer. 60% of the white-collar economy was working remotely last summer, and it's now fallen to 20%. Now, I think that some people looking at this can say, wow, that is a huge decline in the share of Americans that are working remotely. At the same time, focus not just on the rate, but on the level. Over 20% of people working in managerial and professional services jobs are still working remotely. And in February 2020, it was like 2. One more chart. This is the percentage of job postings containing remote terms on the online job search engine Indeed. What you see here is basically, even though 70 to 90, 95% of white-collar workers have been vaccinated in this economy, you still have a tripling of the share of job postings that mention hard work. This, I think, is the skeleton key to understanding that remote work is going to be a permanent part of our economy going forward, even when COVID becomes hopefully something more like an annual flu rather than a pandemic. This suggests to me that companies have internalized the idea that we are living in a remote forever or hybrid forever economy. So work from home is very much here to stay. And that leaves a very big important question, which is, what will it do to us? It is not one big thing. It is many, many things. It will be a dream for some. It will be a nightmare for others. But I think it's a huge and inevitable part of the future of work that's going to have winners and losers. And the fact that it has winners and losers is, I think, is really, really important when thinking about how we can manage it from a policy standpoint and from a managerial standpoint. So who are the winners? Ground zero, I think, for who stands to benefit from work from home in the near future is something like a 45-year-old software engineer who used to work in the downtown area but now can do the same work for the same salary living in the suburbs and working from his or her couch. Same work, less commuting, more time with the family. That is a win-win-win-win-win. Winner number 2, introverts. I've been doing a lot of thinking about the psychological profile of workers over the last year, because I find it so interesting that while I'm not one of the Myers-Briggs people who thinks that we can all put ourselves in either the introvert or the extrovert bucket, we're probably more evenly distributed like a Gaussian curve, and a lot of us are like extroverted introverts, and like that's how we describe ourselves. At the same time, I think that work from home has a very, very disparate effect on people that are on one side of that curve versus the other. In my experience, extroverts love and miss the office. They walk in, they're immediately rejuvenated by the presence of others. They get to talk, they make people laugh, they feel well-liked and competent and great, and they go home like sort of surfing that wave of feeling good by being around people. Meanwhile, I'm a writer, which means I know a lot of introverts, and am myself a little bit introverted. I'm probably somewhere in the middle of that curve. And the introverts in my life are like this is, in many ways, like, please don't say this with quoting me, but like one of the best times of my life. I love working at home. I love not going into the office. I love not being accosted by people who are trying to talk my ear off about absolute nothingness. It makes me so socially anxious to think that I might be entering this conversation that might never end. And it's like, oh my God, I have to get back to my desk. They love working from home. So it's just a fact of human diversity that different people thrive in different spaces. And there's not better or worse. There's just distributional curves. There's just differences. And I think we should expect that the virtual spaces of remote work might reward certain skills that went underappreciated in office settings, while there might be certain skills that were really successful in office settings that aren't as successful for remote companies. Like, there's all sorts of studies from the 20th century about how, tall, white men with strong jawlines were overrepresented in like the CEO class, right? Well, maybe there's something about remote work where you're less likely to be able to understand how tall anyone is. You're less likely to be intimidated by the same presence of people, which might just subtly, I'm not suggesting this is an enormous change, but might just subtly shift the sort of skills that are rewarded in virtual versus physical world environments. Now, who else is going to win? I do think that remote work is going to increase entrepreneurship. And the reason is almost phenomenological. It's about the experience of being alone while nominally working for a company. Working from home, I think the connection to the office can attenuate. It can weaken as the connection to the world outside the office expands. Like, if you're at your kitchen counter, hunched over your computer, you are literally as close to your office as you are to LinkedIn, as you are to Twitter, as you are to Instagram, as you are to any Slack message from someone outside your company, as you are to the chats of anyone who exists in your social networks. And by degrees, I wonder if the remote experiment is going to weaken bonds between workers within companies and strengthen the connections between workers outside of the company. As people realize that their connection to the office is mostly virtual, I think more Americans might take on side gigs and even start their own companies. They'll essentially say, look, phenomenologically, I am alone here in my living room, and I might as well monetize my aloneness. I can take on something else. I can try something else, and there's no boss to physically observe me and tell me I shouldn't. So this might sound like a sort of hand-wavy theory about a new age of entrepreneurship, but if you look at the statistics on business formation in the last year, there has been an enormous surge in entrepreneurship that I'm going to talk about, expand on a little bit later in the talk. But people really do seem to be taking the pandemic to break away from their traditional institutions and start something new. And that is, maybe a difficult thing for the project of maintaining office culture, but potentially an exciting thing for the larger American innovation system. So not all winners. There's going to be losers, and not just extroverted managers. The big losers are going to be, I think, downtown landlords, businesses, and big hotels. And I'm not really sure how they won't lose from this picture that I'm drawing. Commercial real estate will just go more unfilled in this future than it was in 2018, 2019. If business travel falls off by even 10, 20%, and I should, just to pause there and put a pin in this, I think a huge part of the remote work future is this idea that we don't need all white-collar workers to move remote for small changes to have huge differences. So, back to the script. If business travel falls off by even 10 or 20%, that means fewer jobs at airlines, at fancy hotels, at restaurants and commercial business districts in downtown areas. Like, business travelers are the ones that pay full freight at luxury hotels on weeknights. Their companies pay for business class seats on airplanes. They use corporate credit cards for limos and lavish meals. And so even if you have a small, 10 to 20%, downshift in business travel, I think the spillover effects through this aspect of the leisure and hospitality economy could be really massive. What's more, emptier offices themselves mean fewer weekday lunches at downtown restaurants, fewer happy hours, fewer window shoppers, less tax revenue from these downtown areas. I think the dropped boulder of remote work could have pretty wide ripple effects when you look at downtown urban economies, like, frankly, the one that I'm speaking in right now. Now, as we move into the summer and fall of 2021, there's another really big labor trend that's come online to join the work from home revolution. And that is the huge increase in quits, the Bureau of Labor Statistics term for people quitting their job, that is sometimes called, if not always called, the Great Resignation. So in April, the number of workers who quit their job in a single month hit an all-time US record. In July, we broke the record. In August, we broke the record again. So the Great Resignation just keeps getting greater, if you choose to think of it like that. Quits are rising in basically every industry. It's especially high in the accommodation and food services industry. That's like hotels and restaurants and bars. In August, 7% of employees in accommodations and food services quit. Right? That's 1 in 14 hotel clerks, restaurant servers, barbacks saying sayonara in 1 month. If you do a really simple and not very sophisticated and probably wrong extrapolation of that, 1 in 14 people quitting every month, just multiply by 14, and that means that the restaurant faces 100% turnover every 14 months. There is an enormous amount of churn in the labor market right now, especially in the lower wage end of the economy. So quitting is a concept that is typically associated with losers and loafers. But this level of quitting, I want to suggest, is actually an expression of optimism. When people quit their job, it's typically because they're saying, I can do better. So for example, you may have heard the story that the golden age of American labor was like 1950s, 1960s. And there's this idea that 20th century workers were so loyal to their company. They just loved their company so much. And they got there at 22, and they stayed there for 40 years, and they got the gold watch, and then they retired. But that's an absolute myth. That is not statistically valid at all. The truth is that people in the 1960s and 1970s quit their jobs a lot. They quit constantly. They quit way more than the average worker did in the 1980s through 2010s. And they were better off for it. So it's good when we see lots of people quitting because it's an expression of labor optimism. An expression of labor optimism that suggests that lots of people are not staying in crappy jobs because they feel that they might starve if they leave, but rather feel like they can leave. And again, the ripple effects of quits are really great, just socially and emotionally and morally. So let's say, for example, that you have an awful, awful restaurant manager who's just a dick to the employees. So what does the hostess do? She quits. I don't have to put up with this. I'll go down the street and work for another restaurant that's going to pay me $3 more an hour. Okay, he says. So what? I'll hire someone else. There's 6 million people waiting in the sidelines of the economy. He brings in someone else to be the hostess. He's still a jerk. She quits. He brings in someone else. Fine, it's easy. I'll just hire someone else. She quits. Now suddenly, that manager realizes, I need to change my behavior. I need to change the way that I treat people because I am being punished for it in a way that I'm not used to. So I think in surprising ways, that somewhat merge maybe economic psychology and sort of just mushy prediction, I do think that a high quits rate can make the workplace better for all of us because it forces managers to make jobs good enough for people to stay in. And that's why fundamentally I do think that the Great Resignation is great. One more reason. Quitting is good for your career because exploration is good for your career. The most interesting psychology of work paper that I read this year was by a group of economists on the phenomenon of hot streaks in your career. So hot streaks are a subject you might be most familiar with in sports. I loved playing NBA Jam when I was a kid. If you made a few shots in a row in NBA Jam, they said you're on fire. And then when you dunked, the announcer would say boom shakalaka. It was fantastic. You can have hot streaks in your life. I think we all sort of recognize this in a way. Aren't there some times you just feel like you're totally on top of the world at work and all of your ideas are A+, and you're just absolutely kicking it? And then other times, that's just not the case at all, right? We sometimes feel like we have these hot streaks. So that's not just a feeling. It's actually an empirical fact. 3 years ago, Northwestern economist Daxun Wang and a group of researchers, let me see if I have that quit. Oh, it's back here. Sorry, I'm going to go back. There we are. Looked at the career outputs of 20,000 artists and film directors and scientists. And they found that all of them had very high clusters of really successful work as determined by higher than average auction prices for their art, IMDb film ratings, or science journal citations. Everyone had a period in their life when they produced at their best. So where do hot streaks come from? That was the big question here. How do we get hot in our careers? And in this paper, he found that artists and scientists tend to experiment with diverse styles or topics just before their hot streak begins. They would have a period of exploration followed by a period of exploitation. They would explore a bunch of ideas, deliberate over which idea was the right fit for their skills and interests, and then exploit that subject like hell. So for an example, Wang pointed me to Jackson Pollock, the artist known for splashing and dribbling paint on a canvas. And when Pollock started painting in the early 1930s, he experimented with a bunch of styles, abstract art, surrealism that kind of looked like a Marc Chagall painting. And then in the mid-1940s, he honed that mystically messy drip style in which he painted almost exclusively for about 4 years. In 1949, Life magazine says that he is the greatest living painter in the United States. And then the next year, at the height of his fame, he stops doing that and does something else until his death. So for artists, film directors, and scientists, it's not that you should always explore or always exploit, but rather have periods of trial and error that are followed immediately by periods of deliberate focus that seems to increase the probability of a hot streak. Now, I think if you merge this exploration thesis with the rise in quits, you get a pretty optimistic story. You see in the Bureau of Labor Statistics data that people are exploring, that they feel they have a green light to explore more ideas in their career and in the economy. And that should improve the odds that we get more fruitful exploitation out of the labor force. And that sounds bad because it sounds like exploiting the labor force, but more exploitation by individuals of ideas in their career. The quitting makes it more likely, fundamentally, that this generation's hot streaks will be even hotter. So the Great Resignation is not the only great R word that I think is overhauling the labor force right now. There is also the great rudeness, which I've touched on. Airlines in the US, this is unbelievable, reported that by June this year, the number of unruly passengers had already broken annual records. So the land speed rate of rudeness is double its previous high when it comes to airline passengers. Just remarkable. There was a famous Cape Cod restaurant that made national headlines when they announced they were going to close their doors briefly because the clientele was just being too consistently awful and they needed to give their waiters a break. I think, cabin fevered, filled with rage, a lot of American customers have just poured into this late pandemic economy with abandon, like the unfurling of so many pinched up garden hoses, and they've just been an absolute menace. And so I don't blame a lot of people, especially in the services economy, who've essentially said, to hell with all that, I don't need it, I'm going to do something else. Third, there's the great reshuffling of people and businesses around the country. For decades, many measures of US entrepreneurship were in decline, really since the 1970s. But business formation, like I said, has surged since the beginning of the pandemic. This is a really, really cool trend. So several years ago, I wrote this article about how the US had lost its mojo. By mojo, I basically meant our business dynamism. People were moving less to start jobs. They were starting companies less. But now that's totally reversed. Our mojo is back. We're moving more. We're starting companies more. We feel more comfortable saying, I quit. We feel more comfortable working for ourselves. These are really, really good trends that could potentially point the US economy in a fantastic direction in the next decade. Finally, the basic terms of employment are undergoing what I call a great reset. So the pandemic thrust many families into this homebound lifestyle where they couldn't leave their house that was in a way kind of reminiscent of the pre-modern 19th century agrarian economy. Right? Like people used to live at home, educate their kids at home, grow their food at home, not go into the city. Their entire life existed within those four walls and the plot of land just outside of it. And so in a way, we're going back to the 19th century, but this time with screens galore and online delivery. Many families work at home, cook at home, care for kids at home, entertain themselves at home, school their kids at home. And the writer Aaron Wren called this the rise of the DIY family, which I think is really interesting. It represents a new vision of work-life balance that I think is still coming into focus. By eliminating the office as a physical presence, for many, the pandemic might have downgraded the significance and essentiality of work in people's lives. The share of Americans who said they plan to work beyond 62 just recently fell to its lowest number since the Federal Reserve started taking polls. So fewer people than ever say that they feel like it's a critical part of their life to work past 62. This tells me that for many people, despite the fact that they are merging work and life in their lives, they're looking for a new negotiation. They're looking for a new social contract in their own life between the role of work and the role of living. As a general rule, crises leave unpredictable marks on American history that are very, very difficult to see until they happen. So on the left, you have a picture of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. And on the right, you have a picture of the first ever skyscraper built in the world, also in Chicago, in 1885. And historians now think that it was precisely because of the Great Chicago Fire that cleared out downtown Chicago, created an open space where lots of experimental architects could move and work out different ideas about steel skeleton construction, that you invented what we now call and what a Chicago writer called a skyscraper. You could be equally surprised that one of the most important scientific legacies of World War II had nothing to do with bombs, weapons, manufacturing, but rather that the conflict accelerated the development of penicillin and flu vaccines. So I think that the legacy of the Great Chicago Fire and the legacy of World War II tell us that crises leave surprising footprints in American history. I would not have predicted in March 2020 that one of the most significant long-term implications of the pandemic is that it would change white-collar work forever. But I think it is. We are seeing a kind of Chicago Fire moment for the workforce. So in the big picture, what does all this data tell us about the edge of the present for work? Well, we're seeing a rise in remote work, that's for sure. We're seeing more quits and more experimentation, that's for sure. And we're seeing a kind of psychological great reset, where people are reevaluating the role of work in their life. And this takes me right back to my thesis, the great work-life convergence. Knowledge work blends work and life skills. Computers blend work and life tools. Remote work blends work and life time. I see two paths forward. Either we allow this convergence to drive us crazy, become lost in our work, where every single week is a 7-day work week and every work day is a 10-hour work day, and we place unrealistic expectations on what our jobs can do for us, for our souls, for our identity, for our sense of purpose in the world. Or we seize this opportunity to reimagine the way that work and life can fit together for us, for our companies, and for society. I wanted to give a quick and concrete example for how this reconsideration might work out. About 2 hours ago, this is a very late-breaking addition to the presentation, I got off the phone with Brian Chesky, the CEO of Airbnb, for a story that I'm doing about how Airbnb is faring in the pandemic. And he pointed out the company is seeing an increase in long-term travel and long weekend travel. More weekend shoulder days are being taken off, the Friday or the Monday. More regular weekends are becoming 3-day holiday-style weekends. More people are traveling with pets. More people filtering for strong Wi-Fi connections when they book. What does all of this suggest to Brian? That more vacations are becoming workcations. They're becoming trips where people say, I want to go to that beach, or I want to go to that city, or I just want to go to that place find a big house, bring my partner, bring the dog, bring the kids, make sure the Wi-Fi is up to snuff. And we're going to have a little bit of a break, but I'm also going to take 7 Zoom calls over those 5 days, and it'll be kind of a work day and kind of a vacation. It'll be a workation. So I read, Brian, my convergence theory, the slide that came just before this. I literally was looking at it, and I read it right off of the PowerPoint. And he told me something fascinating. He said, I think everything converges. The iPhone converged my calculator and my stock picker, and the home is becoming similarly multi-use. Travel, work, living, these used to be compartmentalized. We traveled in one space, we worked in a different space, we lived in another space. Now it's all coming together. The modality of the home is changing. Home, and this is the quote that you see, used to be a place to live. When it's a place to work as well, that has big effects on work and life and, germane to his business, travel. Home used to be a place to live, now it's a place to work, and that changes work, life, and travel. I think this is a beautiful, deep idea that has all sorts of implications for how we work and live and travel in the next decade. The future will be blended. Thank you very much.
I get the, we have time for a couple of questions. I'll kick things off. What cryptocurrency should we buy? No, I'm just kidding. Don't have to answer that. But I'm curious about the soft work. Any examples of organizations that are able to still channel that, tools? You know, if I'm running a team, any way I can still utilize that, you know, in this new world?
Absolutely. I think the organizations and companies that are best at approximating the benefits of soft work in a remote environment are those that were built to be remote first, right? Which is not most companies that are currently remote because they were forced to be remote by epidemiology. So like my best friend, entrepreneur, lives in Washington, D.C. He has, or part-time, has a company that's based in Africa. They were remote from the beginning. And what he did was recognize that people didn't feel a sense of culture unless they saw themselves, saw each other in the flesh. And so they had work retreats and offsites not once a year, not twice a year, like every 2 months, every 6 weeks. I mean, it was especially possible when they were a smaller company. Now they're many hundreds of employees, large companies. So getting 1,000 people together in an offsite is pretty difficult, unless you, I don't know, some crazy chateau on Airbnb. So what he's essentially realized is that you have to build remote first culture, you need to deliberately plan for non-frequent, non-remote company experiences. And that to me just says that yes, I'm sure that there are benefits to remote work that can be recapitulated online. So for example, coming across fascinating ideas outside of my own brain. I can do that in the office, but I can also do that on Twitter. I do it every day on Twitter. I love the people that I follow, and they inspire me all the time. So they're kind of colleagues in that respect. So that's a narrow way in which the internet can retrace some of the lines initially drawn by the office. But I think there are certain psychological, almost touchy-feely needs that we have that can't, for the most part, for all people, merely be met by internet connections. It has to be satisfied by certain physical world experiences, and we just need to design for them.
One more question if there's one. Okay, can we get a mic down there? Thank you.
Hey, so I recently read about how the working from home environment has sort of created some sort of disadvantage for parents or women, and that one way that companies have sought to counter that is if one person is going to attend a meeting from video, then everyone then has to. What are your thoughts on that, and do you think that that's something that's going to become more common?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and one point that I've made in articles that I now regret not having made in the direct talk, but I'm really grateful that I can make it now, is that remote work in the post-pandemic future won't be as terrible as remote work during the pandemic. Because in a world where schools are open and cafes are open and restaurants are open, working parents aren't going to have to face this scenario where they have to be the equivalent of the 19th century family that I talked about that is doing homeschooling while running the meeting, right? The schools will be open. If they want to homeschool, that's their prerogative, but the schools will be open. And so there's a lot of challenges that parents had in the last 19 months that hopefully they won't have in the next decade and just going forward. At the same time, what you raise is not just a point about the problems of the pandemic, but a point about equity. And I think this is one of those really, really important things for different companies to get right by understanding the needs of their individual employees. I think there are going to be some workers, for example, who feel extremely put out when they're the only remote person in the meeting, and they feel like they're constantly missing out on the culture of the office by being away. At the same time, there just might be other workers that don't feel that way, that when they pull up their Zoom and what they get is that sort of like, fisheye lens view of the long conference table with a bunch of people sitting around it, they're like, I don't care, right? So it ultimately falls, and I don't talk about this in the talk because it's so individual, it ultimately falls to these managers to have deep, emotional conversations with their employees to understand what their needs are, what makes them feel comfortable and what doesn't. I think the example that you raised is a totally feasible example. And this answer is not cutting against it. It's just to say that I think different managers are going to have to make their own choices by understanding the psychological profiles and preferences of their workers. And it's probably not for me, like on a dais, to say, like some Caesar of remote work, this is how it's going to be. Because I don't know how it's going to be, and people are just so different.
Derek, I want to say thank you so much for joining us. That was incredibly enlightening, and we'll now set for our final session of the day.
Great. Thank you.